Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session on beyond GDP and the SSPs. We have it's mostly going to be a panel discussion. So we're going to ask the four panelists to start with some opening comments. So we have Rob Billing from the OECD, Lionel Fontanier from CEPI. This will be the order. Marijke Kuiper from Wageningen Research, and Steve Rose from EPRI. So without further ado, Rob, I'll pass the hand to you. They're going to each have opening statements for about 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up.
All right. Thanks, Dominique. I'm not sure I need 5 minutes, although I can easily talk longer. I have just to start off this discussion. I don't have a paper to present, so I don't, have results or anything to discuss. I just wanted to raise a few topics that I think are relevant for this discussion, and some economic dimensions that are important for integrated assessment models, and that I think economists and integrated assessment modelers need to talk to each other more often about. And that is, the first one is exchange rates. And I'm sometimes baffled by people that have a model that has GDP and emissions and then concentrations, etc. And I talk to them, and very often, they grill me on what's your global warming potentials that you use to convert the different greenhouse gases into CO2 equivalents. And I say, well, for me, the handy one is the one that UNFCCC uses rather than the later IPCC ones. And that becomes a big thing, right? What's the equivalent of methane? And then I ask them, what unit do you use for your GDP projections? And they get silent because, I use the GDP projections from this source. Yeah, but what's the base year for doing this? And I think there's a world to gain for understanding better across the group what it means when you have market exchange rate versus purchasing power parities, for example. As economists, we use market exchange rates, which are the exchange rates that you see in traded commodities. So you look at traded commodities, and then you figure out, this is the exchange rate that people are using in their traded commodities, but that's something different than the basket of commodities that you consume domestically, because not all commodities are traded. So when you want to compare how wealthy is a country, how rich are you can't use this market exchange rate, because then you would ignore the effects of non-traded goods. So then you switch to purchasing power parities. And I think almost all the big integrated assessment models have understood this by now, and they are using purchasing power parities in their models, which is a good thing. But there's also things like, what's the base year for your constant prices? Yesterday we had a session on updating the GDP projections in the SSPs, and Johannes Koch had an intervention there, and that was very clear that if you change your base year for your PPP exchange rate across economies, if you move from 2005 exchange rate to 2017 exchange rate, suddenly the weight of China in your global GDP is 1.5 or 2 times as high as it was in the old PPPs, because in the old PPPs, China was a much smaller economy, so their share in the total global economy was smaller, and therefore their weight was much smaller. So the base year for constant prices matters. Second thing that's important is structural change. So if you have a CGE model, as economists, we often use CGE models that represent all these sectors in the economy, and then what you get is that some sectors grow more rapidly than other sectors, and you get an imbalance between how the final demand per households evolves versus how the production evolves, and then you have international trade to kind of balance that. But what happens in models where you have an energy sector, or you have land-using sectors, but you're not modeling total trade across economies? How does that work? How does that add up to current account balances? If you have suddenly a country that starts exporting, there's more demand for fossil fuels, you have more exports of fossil fuels. What does that mean for the current account balance, the exchange rate for that economy? Is that something that we've thought about properly? So then also for international trade, I think it's very interesting. So the SSP projection that we do for GDP is a macroeconomic projection, whereas if you think about it from a development economics perspective, there's much more interesting stories to be told by looking at how countries have, for example, industry-led economic growth. So you build up a domestic industry sector, but it doesn't mean that you're building that up for your domestic consumers. Your domestic consumers don't want all these industrial goods. You're building that up in order to trade more. So by opening up your trade, you can have a differentiation between the development of your industry sector. You can specialize in certain commodities where you're good at, for example, because your wages are low, so you can have this specialization in these commodities, and then your consumption can actually evolve on a different profile. And that's a major explanation in development economics of economic growth. But these macro models that we use for GDP don't have that effect at all in there. It's implicitly in there, but it's not explicitly in there. And I think we can do more on looking at sectoral effects together with trade to look at that. And finally, welfare and inequality. If you just look at GDP, GDP is not a good indicator of economic growth. We all agree on that. Economists agree on that. We just don't agree on what's a better indicator. That's a problem. And looking at welfare is important. Looking at inequality, looking at welfare allows you to look at inequality. And I think there's quite a bit of interesting analysis. Yesterday there was a session on inequality and distributional aspects of certain policies, of climate policies. What I missed there a little bit is that everything seems to be organized around looking at effects on income, because that's the easy thing to do. You differentiate your households based on different income groups, because that's what you have data for. But of course, climate policy is all about changing relative prices, making some things more expensive, other things cheaper. So by only looking at the income side of how households are affected, you're ignoring a big difference in how the expenditure side is affected. And the last thing, and I'm definitely not an expert on that, is downscaling. If you have regional models, how can we build good downscaling? And I think there's a lot of interesting work done in the EU. There's a lot of interesting work done in the US. But beyond that, I don't think we're very good yet as economists at downscaling GDP projections to the more regional level, or economic projections in general. So, 1 minute? Yeah, that should be enough. So that got me thinking, I'm making these SSP GDP projections. What can I do better in the future myself? And I came up with a short list. One is energy rents. We have energy rents in the model to explain the GDP of fossil fuel exporting countries. But the link with the energy models and the integrated assessment models is actually quite weak. So we have a very static database of production costs, and we have a pathway for oil prices and gas prices. And these prices we can link to the different SSPs, but the production costs in our side are just some database that we look up, and we look at the difference between production costs and the global price to figure out what the rents are that the countries get in that. And also, maybe we need to change this and not talk about energy rents, but talk about commodity rents. Especially in Africa, countries are relying not on fossil fuels exports, but they're relying on commodity exports beyond fossil fuels. We don't have a good handle on that, so we need to investigate that further. And then finally, this links nicely back to our plenary session yesterday on democracy. Yes, we do need better indicators for institutional and governance issues. I'm not advocating that all of that is democracy, but maybe there's a role for indicators like that to improve our understanding how institutional and governance indicators affect GDP growth, and especially the speed with which countries catch up to their frontier. We have product market regulations as an indicator, the econometric indicator, that says something about the ease with which producers can change their behavior, but also can sell on markets, and that affects our long-term frontier. But that's a fairly limited economic perspective on this thing, and I think there is interesting work out there on governance indicators that we might tap into and do something better in the future. With that, I thank you.
Our next speaker is Lionel Fontanier, currently with the Banque de France. Let's get this loaded. Lionel, you have 24 slides in 5 minutes? Are you?
No, this is not the right one.
This is not the right one? There should be a short one?
This is the short one.
Oh, okay, sorry. Thank you. Go ahead, Lionel.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. So I don't insist on the usual disclaimer when you are a central banker, even temporarily. So what I'm going to present shortly is based on a paper with Cecilia Bellora. So you're going to find the paper on the site of the conference and also the long version of the slides. And so I will just throw in the discussion a series of issues, questions. So what we do in this paper is very much in line with what Rob just discussed. We combine a growth model, a macroeconomic model, with a dynamic global and sectoral general equilibrium model. So this is basically what we do. And so the two models are for the macroeconomic model MAGE. And so if you look for MAGE on internet or if you go to my page, you will see what it is about, but I'm going to give some details. And the CGE model is MIRAGE in the version which is called MIRAGE VA for value added. So what is it about? Let's start with MAGE. So what we do is that we project GDP for 107 countries in the world till 2050, 2100. And we use for this long-term series. Certain series start in 1950 and they go up 2018. And so we have a structural model, and so we derive optimality conditions, etc. So we are economists at the end, nobody is perfect. And so these functional relationships between observables are estimated and then projected. And so the originality of this work is that we have three factors in the model. So we have indeed capital and labor, and we have energy. And so we put much focus on energy and also on the labor market. So we have basically four elements that have to be modeled and then projected. One is about labor, one is about capital, one is about energy, and one is about the technical progress. So about the labor, we use, and this is something which is different from the SSPs, we use the UN central scenario. We have beams of 5 years by gender, and we have female participation to the labor market, which is important for developing economies. And then we have human capital, so education, and so we have a catching up process at the regional level to a certain, frontier. When it comes to capital, and it is exactly in line with what Rob said, so indeed we have to think of savings, and when you have the demography and when you have the life cycle of savings, when you combine the two, indeed, you obtain the macro savings rate, which is changing over time. And you have investment, but what we have here is capital mobility, because we think that capital mobility, international capital mobility is important, and so we have kind of French-Stein or Yoka mechanism in the model. And so meaning that at the end of the day, when you combine savings, capital mobility, and investment, what remains, the difference between I and S, as we all know, is the current account. And so what is interesting there is that we project the current account on some basis for the 170 countries in the world till, for instance, 2050. And so we're going to impose this trajectory of the current account to the global, to the CG model. So this is important because there are different possibilities in the literature, as you may know. So sometimes people say, well, at this horizon, current account will go back to balance. Why so? We don't know. Or the current account, if it is, for instance, negative, so you take what it is and you project this as constant. So it doesn't make any sense either. So what we have here is a current account which varies over time because of investment, savings, and capital mobility. On energy, we model energy efficiency, which is different from the ratio of energy consumption and the capital. This is something really that comes from the model. And energy efficiency is also following a catching up process. And you have a frontier with the most efficient countries in the world. And based on certain mechanisms, you catch up to this frontier at a certain pace. So this is in the model. And we have the rents. And this is indeed very important. We don't have the commodity rents, but we have the energy rents, as you do. And last but not least, we have technology, as I said. So you have to compute how the TFP, to put it in a nutshell, so the technological level of the country, will evolve over time because you have a frontier and you have a catching up process based on education, etc., etc. So this is how it goes. Now, we're going to impose most of this to the CGE, and this will be the first run of the CGE. I will explain this in a second. And with all this at hand, we're going to define, for instance, and this is what we do in the paper, 2 paths of the global economy till 2040. So we're going to have the business as usual path of the world economy with, in this exercise, no climate policy, and we will have the scenario where we impose the COP26 unconditional NDCs. We impose the EU Fit for 55 policies, including the CBAM and the phasing out of free allowances on the ETS market. Yeah, it's enough. So this is just a teaser. So everyone in the room will jump and so look at the website to see what it is about. So basically what we are doing is a 3-step procedure, to put it in a nutshell, so technically. So the first step is to take all this information from the growth model, from MAGE, and to impose this to Mirage, which is the CGE model. So just in 2 words, Mirage is a CGE with multi-regional input-output table behind it, so the one of GTAP. So you have value-added, trade-in value-added, etc. in the model. So this is a model in imperfect competition. This is dynamic, so the usual thing, nothing really fancy here. This is what everyone is using everywhere. The thing is that we have this embryo behind it and the imperfect competition. So in the first run, you impose all this to Mirage, and you recover the TFP in Mirage that makes the 2 models consistent. Okay? So this is the first one. The TFP is endogenous in the model. So we have a different TFP for agriculture, but I don't enter into this. Now, in the second and third step, this TFP that was originally endogenous becomes indeed exogenous. So you fix the trajectory of technical progress in each region of the world economy. And then the GDP becomes indeed endogenous. So this is how it goes. In the second step, you can plug in whatever you need in order to make your baseline consistent with what you see around you. And so, for instance, in this exercise, we say, Brexit might be something important. You may say, why? The UK is not such a huge economy at the world level. But the problem is that we are speaking of the ETS market, and our British friends going to exit or have actually exited the ETS market. So it changes very much the picture. So here, in this second step, we do a run with the Brexit. And then this is the baseline. And on this baseline, then you shock the baseline with the shock that you are interested in. And in the paper, what we do, in order to fix the idea about the cost and benefit of climate change, is, as I said, that we introduce the ETS market in Europe with an endogenous price of carbon on the ETS market. Then we have a second price of carbon within Europe for the rest of the sectors, which correspond to the implicit, cost of regulations plus additional taxes. So this is for the rest of the economy. And then in the EU, since we take the Fit for 55 package seriously, we introduce the CBAM, so the compensation at the border for carbon, and we phase out the free allowances, which is something which is in the air but has not been decided yet at the Council level. And last, we have to consider what other countries are doing, because this is a global model, and this is where it becomes difficult. And this is where you may be in a situation where not all the assumptions that you make are politically correct or diplomatically correct. And so what we consider is that only countries that have unconditional NDCs will respect their NDCs. If NDCs are conditional, then countries won't respect it, because, this is not something that will happen at the end of the day. Then we add a second layer of conditions, and the second layer of conditions is that only countries that have a national carbon market at the end of 2021, for instance, will be in position of, reaching their targets. And so when you combine all these conditions, this is the shock that you impose to the economy. And so you have a trajectory of the world economy that goes much beyond GDP, because you have all the elements that I was mentioning, like the actual functioning of the labor market in developing economies with gender issues, like energy efficiency, like technical progress, like the trajectory of the current account which is imposed to the model. And you shock the model and you obtain indeed, responses in terms of GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, and GDP changes and sectoral impact, etc., etc. All these in the paper, and I'm happy to discuss further during the exchange of questions and answers. Thank you.
You guys are destroying my reputation as a taskmaster, but all right. Our next speaker will be Marijke Kuiper from Wageningen Research. And apologies.
This one.
She pronounces my name much better than I can, so I'm sure I can pronounce your name very well. Yeah, that one.
That one, yeah.
All right, 5 minutes, John.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I'm more on the line of Rob. I don't have a paper results to present, and I'm also feeling a bit of an outsider since I've not been deeply involved in climate change assessments, although my team has been. So what I want to talk about, is about labor. And I wasn't sure about the audience, so I thought I'd give you like a quick thing. So why are we all obsessed with this GDP per capita thing, right? We've been talking about it during the conference. And it's basically the one that binds them all. It's the one literally binding them all. I've done some multi-model assessments, and the only thing we can actually agree upon with each other is GDP and population. Anything beyond that, we basically end up agreeing to disagree. So I really like this combining thing. Why is this? Why are we so obsessed with that? Well, basically GDP per capita. In economics, we have a few laws where a few things are really fixed, but Engel's law is one of them. Basically means if your incomes go up, so GDP per capita is taken as a proxy of income, it means that you shift your expenditure pattern, you go from cereals to meat. I mean, people that have done climate stuff are, I think, fully aware of this whole discussion that the global population will start eating more meat, so we have to think about emissions. But they also start consuming more non-food expenditures, which have emission impacts. Basically, it means you get a structural change in production, so your economy starts changing, and that, of course, then translates to differences in environmental pressure. So there are different places where stuff gets produced, what gets consumed, and this changes the global pattern of where problems are. So this basically is a demand link. So you have this income, and that generates a whole system, basically, of production. And I think this is one of the reasons why we're also obsessed with this GDP per capita, and we basically forget about anything else. But basically, GDP is it's a two-sided thing as an economist, right? You have your expenditures, but you need to generate the income. So GDP is also from the income side. Basically, it's the payments to your endowments, so the stuff that you have available in your economy to produce things. Land, labor, capital, natural resources. And here I'm always intrigued. I've done quite some interactions with, say, biophysical models, and they love to have loads of variability, right? In land types and land things and slopes and inclines and I don't know what. They also like to really talk about difference in fossil fuels and things like that. Basically, anything you can see on a satellite image, we have a lot of like spatial variability. People get always really excited about it, want to get all the details in and things like that. But as an economist, I think there's also a lot of variability in labor. Basically, the amount of and type of labor that you have available. And it basically gets ignored. I mean, at least the PE models that I know kind of don't even distinguish labor. They just have some sort of like production thingy that gets payments and then something happens to that. So that is all load of detail on the land and the biophysical elements, but not on labor. But actually it's very key. It's key for structural change. But it's also key for income distribution. And if you then talk to policymakers, what they care about is who's actually losing their job and losing their income and who's gaining it. Because for acceptance and policy shifts, that's really a key thing. So I've also run a global CG model. I don't really want to go into detail, but basically what we've been working on is that we actually increased the number of labor types that we have, 5 occupations, and we added the number of workers, because we got these continuous questions like how many people actually are working in a sector, how many changes are there? We're definitely not there. This is really work in progress, but the key things that actually we learned. So the first thing is that policymakers get very excited about it. We get now a lot of like projects linked to this because like, oh, you guys can say something about workers and we need that. The other thing, though, is that I actually computed the wages because I have the number of workers and I have payments to labor, right? Now, all of our models have this agricultural, non-agricultural segmentation. We know that there are big wage gaps between that. But then when I looked in the non-agricultural sector, and that's a slide from one of the projects we did, you see there's a huge variability in income within sectors. So basically it means that people with the same, say, education level, occupation level, can earn a completely different income if they're in a different sector. As an economist, and the way we model this is that people can easily move between sectors. That's our standard assumption, apart from ag, non-ag, but within the non-ag you can move anywhere you like to go without any frictions. If you look at these numbers, that's not true. It means people are stuck for some reason in the sector. It actually means that we're overestimating the labor market adjustments to any structural change or any massive changes to the system. And this is really, basically for the economists in the room, this is something I think we need to work on and get much better at because it's going to be key. So this was a slide for the economists. Then also try to make a slide for the non-economists. So why should you care? If you're not an economist, why does this matter? Well, the first thing we had, I was in a session yesterday about what technologies and how these change. And I was thinking, if you change the technology, you probably need a very different skill set. And you can just assume that the thing will be there, but if you don't have the people that actually have the skills, so if you close, say, a coal mine and you want to go into something about, some new technologies, say solar panels, you need people that can install a solar panel. I'm pretty sure that a guy that's working in a coal mine cannot instantaneously start installing a solar panel. So you need to do something there. So knowing this amount of labor that you have and what's available and maybe intervene on that, does also give you a policy lever. Because if you know that this is key, you can also start working on it and making sure that people are available to make your technology happen. And the other thing I'm working with, and that's the last point Rob also mentioned, is that we want to get this more local. So we're actually working with microsimulation models that take this occupation information that we have, link it to household surveys, and they try to work out, so where are these impacts? Where are people losing their jobs? Where are people actually gaining more income? And get this really localized impacts, because it matters if people are able to cope with things that you are doing. That's it.
Improving my reputation. Thank you very much. All right. So our final speaker is Steve Rose, who's with EPRI. He's going to be talking about uncertainty. I think you're working with the MIT team on it. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Steve.
So let me thank Dominic and Rob, first of all, for organizing this session. So I think it's a great topic. I'll leave you hanging on that. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. So while things are getting sorted out up there, I'll just say a couple things. So this work was motivated by our interest in trying to better understand structural uncertainty. So not structural from a modeling point of view, like one model versus another, but structure of the economy. So trying to get a better sense of whether we could characterize in more rigorous terms possibilities in terms of future societies that could evolve out there. And that's work that can essentially inform a lot of the different kinds of applications that we're all interested in. So it can help us think about potential transitions in terms of trying to address climate change. It can help us think about potential societies that could be exposed to different levels of climate change and what might be their risks and vulnerability and more. This is work, as Dominic alluded to, that I've been doing with Jennifer Morris and with Angela Gergel at MIT. And in this context, we've characterized 150 parametric distributions that are defining the possibilities for the economy in terms of how it might evolve. Those have to do with things like economic growth, resource availability, technological change, energy efficiency, and other variables, just other parameters. We're evaluating then 400 different simulations in terms of looking at the future, where we're doing random draws over those parametric distributions using Latin hypercube sampling, and then trying to essentially look at what that might imply. We're looking at two different kinds of uncertainty in this context. One has to do with simple economic system dynamics, just trying to understand what might be the possibilities and how the societies might evolve. And the other has to do with deep uncertainty about policy. And I'll talk about both in a second. So on the left-hand side is just giving you in that shaded area there an impression of what might global uncertainty in terms of the economic dynamics of the system imply in terms of emissions without climate policy. So we see an actual very broad range of possible global emissions futures without climate policy, simply due to that structural uncertainty in the system. Then we're evaluating different global emissions pathways. So below that on your left-hand side are different emissions pathways associated with different levels of global emissions ambition for different temperature goals. And in that context, we can then evaluate what that structural uncertainty implies in terms of uncertainty about what kinds of subglobal systems would be consistent with that global emissions future. So we can say for a given global emissions pathway, what kinds of economies, what kinds of energy systems, what kinds of technological deployment might essentially be consistent with that particular global emissions pathway. On the other side, on the right-hand side here, is just a U.S. picture. So to give you some sense of both that reference and the pink at the top, uncertainty in terms of just how that structural uncertainty might impact the evolution of that economy, and in this case, just the picture of emissions. And then below that is the uncertainty regarding those different global emissions pathways, where we can get some sense of what might be the possibilities in terms of just managing emissions within the U.S. And then we can look at the underlying details to get a better sense of what's actually changing in terms of transforming the economy. So I'm just going to show you a couple pictures to give you some sense of the results that we're generating in this context. This is another U.S. picture for 2050, so now we're just taking a snapshot and looking at the distributions that are generated for that particular point in time for the energy system. So you have total primary energy on the left, fossil primary energy in the middle, and electricity generation on the right. Across the top are the reference results. So we already see just in that reference case without climate policy, there's a lot of different possible energy systems that would be consistent, that would be associated with that reference condition without climate policy. As we move down to the lower rows, we're moving into climate policy. So a less ambitious policy, which is essentially limiting warming to above 2 degrees, and then a more ambitious policy that's limiting warming to 2 degrees. If you look down any one of those columns, you'll see how the distributions are shifting to the left, right? So we're moving the system to the left. We're not only changing the location of those distributions, we're changing the shape of those distributions. So that's one point. But the other thing, the key takeaway here is that we see uncertainty in all these different levels of ambition. So we're moving into context of trying to pursue a particular global emissions objective. There's actually quite a few different possible energy systems that can be consistent with that context. In the case of the different policy outcomes, we have two different contexts. One is this optimistic context where we assume the availability of international emissions allowance trading, we assume the availability of carbon dioxide removal technologies, and we assume that land-based mitigation is also activated. In the pessimistic context, we don't allow for any of those things. So essentially, the economies are pursuing mitigation on their own. They don't have access to negative emissions. They don't have access to land-based mitigation. Both those contexts matter from a risk point of view, right? So there's uncertainty about how policy might unfold. One could be this optimistic context, or it could potentially be this pessimistic context. And you can certainly make an argument that maybe it's more likely to be the pessimistic context. But either way, we're talking about broad ranges. Either way, we're talking about broad ranges within any one of those contexts, and then across those contexts, even a broader range. To the point where where the high end could be potentially 5 to 6 times larger than the small end of that particular portion of the energy system. So a significant amount of uncertainty in any one of those contexts. Just another picture. This is looking at Brazil this time. Similar story in terms of moving from the top down to the bottom, in terms of the distribution shifting to the left and changing in shape. But then there's a different story because it's another region that has different opportunities in terms of reducing emissions, different opportunities in terms of reducing emissions relative to other parts of the world too, right? So I'm not going to get into the details, but there's another story there. Slides are keen to go forward, aren't they? This is just a cost picture to give you some more information. So we're interested not only in trying to better understand how physically the system might evolve from an energy point of view, but also economically, what it might imply in terms of changes in what we're able to do, in terms of the budgets that are available, in terms of budget reallocation implications, and so on. Now I've got the U.S., the EU, and Brazil. in the three different columns. 2-degree policy at the top, the more ambitious policy that's limiting warming below 2 degrees, and then a 1.5 degree policy at the bottom. Similar kind of story, the distributions are shifting to the left, costs are increasing. This is consumption per capita measures of costs. And you can see the optimistic context, the cost risk is fairly narrow, much tighter distributions in that context where you're optimistic about the decarbonization opportunities. In the pessimistic context, we actually see those distributions are quite large, and we now have significant risk in the context of pursuing some of these goals. So just in the case of the about 1.5 degree case, that's the middle column, you can see that U.S. Has a possibility of a 20% loss in consumption per capita. The EU has a possibility of a 30% loss in consumption per capita, and Brazil a 20% loss. Brazil also has the opportunity in the optimistic context of potentially gains, right? So they could find themselves in a situation where they're actually generating revenues associated with those allowance markets. And so you actually see in that context, not just a loss story, but also a possibility of potential gains. So we're learning a lot in terms of being able to think about what might be different economic contexts that can be consistent with different climate objectives in the long run, getting a better characterization of the structure of potential economies and potential risks that might exist in terms of transforming into the future. So just a couple of closing remarks here. One is that we're finding that socioeconomic structural uncertainty or economic uncertainty in terms of the structure of economies is significant. We see it at the global level, but all the way down, and in particularly at that sub-global level. We think that's particularly important. We're seeing that there's many societies that are consistent with any global emissions pathway. So if we're thinking about following any particular trajectory, regardless of what level of ambition you're talking about, we see there's a lot of underlying economies that can be consistent with that pathway. We're seeing that the uncertainty affects not only the size of the economies, but the composition. And that can be extremely important as we think about transformations, as we think about potentially evaluating impacts, characterizing risks, whether you're thinking about in physical transition risk types of terms. It's important to social cost of carbon types of calculations as you're thinking about evaluating potential impacts on sectors and their economic consequences, and more. We're seeing that both the non-climate policy uncertainties as well as the climate policy uncertainties are important. So it's not simply thinking about what might be the uncertainties about the parameters in terms of how the economic dynamics might work, but also uncertainty about policy design and the specification of policies that provide different incentives for how we'll decarbonize. We're seeing that sets of distributions are important, right? So in any one of these individual contexts, we get a distribution, but it's really, if you're a planner, trying to think about what kind of circumstances you're going to be subjected to from a mitigation point of view or from an impacts point of view, you have to be thinking about different levels of global ambition. You have to be thinking about these different types of uncertainty, both policy and non-policy. So I'll just conclude by saying I think this is an important topic, and I think it's something we need to think about harder in terms of how we can better characterize this sub-global uncertainty to get a better sense of the kinds of risks and the opportunities available to us. And to date, we haven't really seen that kind of information. We've only begun to sort of begin to try to tell those stories, especially at the sub-global level, where we can have coherent probabilistic storylines. So not just thinking about the overall characterization of a particular pathway, but trying to have coherency between the different variables and scales and temporal profiles to have consistency in that probabilistic storyline. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks to the four speakers. I think really a broad range of topics were already addressed this morning. I think we can kind of categorize them at least into two groups. So one is kind of at the macro level, what are the macro things that are not in the current SSPs that we need to think about, prices, exchange rates, capital flows. A lot of that was already addressed in some of the presentations. And then kind of the second set of broad issues are more the structural issues, how labor markets are structured, changes in the structures of economies, both internally and across the globe. So I think, why don't we start with kind of the macro questions first? Perhaps the four panelists can come to the front. We've kind of prepared a set of questions, but perhaps before we get to those questions, if there are any kind of urgent questions from the audience, please. And so I don't know many of you, so if you could state your name and affiliation, that would be great. I don't know if we need a microphone. If you speak loud enough, I think we should be okay.
Thanks. I'm Tony Beekman from the University of New South Wales. very familiar with the models you're using, but it seems to me that GDP is mostly an exogenous variable that's being imposed on the models. Is that correct? Maybe can you explain this a little bit?
Or could or should it also be maybe an endogenous variable that's being calculated? Marika, you showed a graph where there's an arrow going away from GDP, but you also showed a graph where there's an arrow going back to GDP, but not from the environment, but certainly climate change impacts have an impact on GDP. And how is that modeled in the models, and should it be more endogenous? And maybe a quick political question as well, because that session is called Beyond GDP. And of course, there is an academic discourse and maybe also political discourse on getting away from GDP altogether, or looking at different indicators that might be maybe more important than GDP. Can you imagine a world of modeling where there's no GDP in the models, or where we don't look at GDP but look at other maybe more important indicators? So it would be great to get your views on that. Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Eric Kemp, Benedict Stockholm Environment Institute. I'll just say I agree completely, with Rob on the importance of structural change and focusing on cost as well as income. But I did want to make one exception to the claim that all of this is about relative price changes. I would argue that what we're talking about is a massive, substantial structural change, and hinting at that with price changes is insufficient. And I think that Marika's presentation got to this, that what happens with labor affects the viability of policies. So I would ask, how can you bring in some governance and policy issues?
All right, one more, and then we'll give it to the panel.
Björn Sörgel, Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Quick comment, also a similar direction as Eric. My impression was that when it comes to distributional effects, we can deal with the expenditure side pretty well in terms of energy and food prices, and the income side in terms of labor market effects, income effects, much worse, at least. That's the case for our own modeling and with the few other studies that I know. And then a quick question to Steve as well. I found that approach with the parametric distributions very interesting, but I wonder how you deal with correlations between input parameters. I think that is very important for the overall probabilistic assessment.
All very good questions. Rob, perhaps you can deal with the GDP question. Lionel, you could follow up. Yeah?
Yeah, sure. I think, I don't know if I have people online, but I've been trained to speak into a microphone here. GDP is endogenous in some of the models. So Lionel and I basically do exactly the same thing. We have a specific model that calculates GDP on the basis of a number of background drivers in terms of investment, capital mobility, catch-up of T to TFP frontiers, etc. And labor participation rates play a role there. So we have a model that basically determines GDP as an endogenous variable. Then we have a different model where we actually look at the structural side of the economy, where we use GDP that we calibrate to the GDP that comes from the macro model. So then it becomes an input, but then when you have that as an input, you do that only for your reference scenario, and then in your policy scenarios, you actually make your technology constant and you have your GDP endogenous again. So you're calibrating your model to the GDP path from the macro model, but it's not actually true that GDP is then exogenous. So there is always a GDP effect. Now on the feedback effect from climate impacts on GDP. This is a topic that comes up every day here. And basically every time I present SSP GDP projections, there is a discussion on that. And my view on that is we do not want to have feedback effects from climate change into these GDP projections in the SSPs, because if I do that, I'm preempting everybody that wants to do impact assessments. And when they then run their models on what's the effect of this type of development on the impacts in a certain economy, they're already stuck with a GDP level that assumes that these impacts will be either large or small, depending on what I assume what they are. So what these people need is a reference scenario in which there are no climate impacts, and then they can do their analysis on how large the impacts are, and thereby construct a GDP pathway that includes these impacts. Now, are we there yet? Maybe after 10 years ago, the idea was we present these SSP scenarios, the IEM community will, or the IAV community actually, will do impact analysis, we'll get a kind of a robust community-wide assessment of how big these impact feedback effects are back on GDP, and maybe we could do a second round where we have two sets of scenarios, one without and one with feedback effects. I don't think we're there yet. In these last 10 years, I think economists have gotten probably have less agreement on the impacts of climate change on the economy than we had 10 years ago. So the order of magnitude of these feedback effects, I think, are still very much debated. So we're not in a position to make a robust projection of GDP with these impacts. So it's up to the community to present that type of scenario. I'll leave it there.
Leonel, you have anything to add?
So I'm perfectly aligned with Rob, but I take this opportunity to add some words. So when it comes to other indicators than GDP, so this is something which is really important. So what people in the field do in general is that, for instance, they look at consumption. So we have seen this in one of the presentations. So consumption in terms of level of consumption, and consumption also, maybe more importantly, in terms of composition. How much will you, spend of your actual income on services versus goods, on transport versus, something else, et cetera, et cetera. So this is something which is very relevant. And then I think that what is also very important is the relative incomes. So depending on the models, it can be between skilled and unskilled or something more detailed, as explained before. And something which is also very important beyond GDP or replacing GDP for the purpose of climate, etc., is indeed emissions. So you have understood that this is, everywhere. Emission not only of CO2 but of all, greenhouse gas. This is something important, in particular if you think of agriculture. And when you speak of emissions, leakages are very important, because when a policy is decided in one place, then indeed the part of this policy will vanish, just because we are living in, for the moment, I'm a bit pessimistic, but maybe for long, in a non-cooperative world. And so most of your effort disappears just because other countries do not engage in the same direction. Now, maybe since I have the mic, on frictions, and this is something for you, Majke. So frictions on the labor market are definitively something important, and as economists, we are all, in a position when it's difficult to model this, because the kind of model that we are using are not exactly designed to do that. Still, the dynamics of the model is helping a bit. And by this, I mean that the models are generally putti-clay, meaning that some of the capital is disappearing from one period to the next, and so you will reallocate your capital depending on the returns to capital in the different sectors. And so this is what drives, the allocation of investment of the different sectors. And so it takes time. And since it takes time, it means that moving workers from one activity to another will also take time, just because the capital is not there. And so if the capital is not there, and if you need to move the workers from one place to another, it means that at the end of the day, the wage will go down, the wage bill will go down, which is a mix of, the number of employees that might go down, and this is what Majke is trying to do, and the actual wage, which might also go down. And so the friction is there. It is represented in this very rough manner, but still, these dynamics of the model, where you shift capital from one sector to another, is something which is helping us to inform policymakers of the possible frictions. What we don't know, and maybe around the table, we will have different views. But what we don't know is what happens when there is very massive and, overnight change in the policies leading to stranded assets. And this is not in the models. So this is something that we can find tricks in order to represent this, but this is not really in the core of the model. So what we can nicely represent is the dynamics when it takes 10 years, 20 years to shift capital from one sector to another. So this we can model it properly. But when it comes to shifting overnight all the capital that was in the brown industries to the green industries, our models are not exactly prepared to do that. And so this type of friction is not well represented in the models, which has huge implications for the, macro, prudential, financial, issues, because this will have a cost for the societies, and this will have a cost for the financial system. This is risky. We have huge uncertainty around this. And this is indeed what the institution I'm working with for the moment is very much aware of and trying to figure out. Thank you.
Yeah, I was about to say, spoken like a true central banker, but you admitted it yourself. So, Mark, I think you wanted to address this issue and then perhaps start then the discussion on the structural issue.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say on beyond GDP and getting more indicators. I think I work a lot with policymakers, and why GDP is so prominent is also because it's really good for elevator analysis, I call it. If it goes up, it's good. If it goes down, it's bad. And people love that. And by the time when we look at well-being indicators, we look at other things we know from the model, we can do more detailed assessments. And then what I find when I then try to communicate that, some things goes up, other things go down. And then is that good or bad? So you end up in that discussion, and people are very uncomfortable with that. They want a single sign, this is good, that's bad thing. And I think as scientists, I think we should do a better job in communicating. Right? There are different dimensions. There is a trade-off, and then I know trade-offs actually is not a good thing to talk about, because then people focus on what they lose. So you get a loss aversion thing. So actually, I think we should not even use trade-offs, but they say there are different impacts, and they see how that pans out. So I think we know a lot about well-being. As economists, we know a lot more. But getting it across and getting that in between people's brains when they actually make policies, we haven't figured out yet how to do that. So that's a good check. Oh, on the labor. Yeah, no, we're really struggling with the labor thing, but what I just know, I've actually now been working again on trade, is that we see from trade analysis that there are very long-run impacts on local labor markets. And that made me think, like, if you now look at these SSP scenarios where you have like really massive shifts in economic structure, it's more than logical to expect there'll be massive, impacts on the labor market. So basically regions where there'll be consistent unemployment for a long period of time, and regions where there will be increases in employment and maybe not enough workers. And I don't think we're capturing that in any way. So apart from the capital thing, I think we need to really spend more time on that and work out how do you handle that. Because, it's not done, I think.
Yes, so Steve, you... Absolutely. Yeah.
At least want to answer the one specific question directed to me, and then maybe I'll offer a couple additional thoughts. So you had asked about correlations between the parameters. Great question. Something that we took very seriously, and we did consider joint distributions in terms of defining the uncertainty up front, and then, of course, that would impact the draws. I'll just say a couple things more. So we have a similar modeling structure to others that you've heard up here. So in terms of representing GDP, it's being derived. We're representing productivity growth, and because we're doing the uncertain draws, we're obviously getting very different GDP storylines with respect to those different parametric conditions that would then allow for a different growth of GDP over time. I also want to just reiterate the importance of looking beyond GDP and looking at the composition of consumption. So not only going past GDP and into things like consumption, but actually looking at how things are actually changing within consumption, I think is really important as we go forward. One other thing I'll just comment on is this issue of governance and policy, and I don't know whether this falls as a separate category or as part of that, but this policy design, I think, is critical, right? So, I just showed some very high-level kinds of in and out kinds of policy design implications, and you can see how much it moved distributions, right? So whether you believe where those distributions are in the right place or not, it's having a huge impact, right, in terms of just shifting things around and potentially a large impact in terms of potential risk. And that's at a very aggregate level of policy design. When we talk about real policies in real places, right, you have to start thinking about the more of the specifics of what's potentially could be implemented, which will change the incentives substantially in terms of how we decarbonize or how we respond in terms of impacts and so on. So, thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Just on GDP, by the way, there are technical issues with its definition. It's a constructed statistic. So the weights matter, how the weights change over time matter, and so when you do model comparison, you have to be very careful that people are defining GDP using kind of the same metrics, because it's not always evident. Yeah.
Can I add one small remark? On GDP versus welfare. Actually, none of our models maximizes GDP. All of them maximize welfare. And then we have these indicators. So we present GDP and we present welfare, we present consumption, because policymakers don't understand the concept of welfare as a measurement in an economic model. So you have to explain that, so then you get to consumption, but what happens to consumption is not always in line with what happens to welfare, so you enter into the more difficult discussions. But I don't think policymakers are still only looking at GDP. It's just not true. First of all, they're looking at jobs before they look at GDP. That's easy. Jobs win out every time. Then secondly, there are discussions with policymakers and also with finance ministries, central bankers, what have you, to be held about health impacts and premature deaths, etc. And they are open to other indicators. It's just that we don't know of a good, robust, integrated way to communicate all that in an elevator pitch to policymakers. So that's why we keep relying on GDP as one of these indicators, saying, well, this is what happens to GDP, that's the short version, and here's the longer version. And then you hope that you can talk to them still outside the elevator.
All right. Please.
Yeah, if I have to continue, I was... From continue. I'm wondering, in all these SSPs, GDP is growing sort of without really flattening out, whereas we have real experiences of countries where GDP is basically flat. For example, in Japan. Japan has a population structure that reflects where many of our countries will arrive at too. That's probably an important reason why the GDP is no longer rising. So I would find it interesting to see some scenarios that also play out that potential future. And the other thing, Rob, you pointed to the rationale for not having a climate feedback on the GDP pathway, which I completely understand given the desire that the purpose that the SSPs were made for. But I think for the IEM modeling, it would really be necessary to have some model runs where you see that impact, because we see this unrealistic future of rising GDPs, and then you have these small changes to the GDP that come from whatever you do with mitigation, and I think it gives really a false picture of the alternatives. And there is, the cost side is represented, but the benefit side is just left out. And even if the benefits are very uncertain, I think that's just the uncertainty that the policymakers will have to grapple with. Thank you.
Over here.
Hi, thanks. I'm Aime Aguilar, and I come from the OECD. I lead the climate change mitigation team. And so coming back to the beyond GDP, so it just seems to me like what you're saying is that in a way, the way you model is influenced by what the policymakers want or need to hear. But in a way, what policymakers are used to looking at as performance indicators also comes from what is informed to them by scenarios. And I'm just thinking that we know more and more that there are limitations by structure of GDP, that GDP as an indicator has a very big mismatch with well-being. I wouldn't say welfare only, but well-being. And in a way, that same mismatch persists if you're looking at consumption. And I think that in a way what we have seen is that we have created high consumption systems without them being high well-being systems. And what I don't see, and maybe I was expecting to see in some of the presentations, were scenarios where a lower GDP or lower consumption trajectory is not seen as something bad, but as something that might be lower in that sense, but could come with better health, with better income distributions, and so on. Because I think this is what we also need as part of the narrative. So that's on the one side. On the other hand, I think I'm working a lot on systems thinking and bringing systems thinking to climate policy. And the way in which we try to see kind of GDP per capita going into consumption patterns is a very exogenous type of thinking, where we just say, well, when incomes grow, then consumption patterns are like this. But we don't look at this is the case in a system that works in this way and that policies have constructed, and therefore policies could also be constructing another type of system where income increases could lead into other behavior. So where could that be in your modeling? That's kind of my question. Thank you.
One more. We had this discussion right before the meeting, and we're saying, one thing we're not capturing, of course, are labor-leisure trade-offs. And Olivier Blanchard made that point when he was chief economist at the IMF, saying, yeah, European GDP is lower than the U.S., but the average European works 69 hours a week, and a year, and the average American worker works 2,200 hours. And so you have a gap there of 600 hours, and that doesn't get measured in GDP, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so Jarmo Kiksa from IASA and Imperial College. And there are actually two economic sessions today, economic scenario sessions. So there's this one, the Beyond GDP one, and right after this, in the Kaminsen, we're going to talk about post-growth scenarios. So I think this is to some extent what you're alluding to, and maybe a bit more. So definitely come. But a rough question perhaps, or a broader question to the panel here that I was wondering about. So especially maybe to Rob, when you're modeling these projections, what do you see yourself as the limits that you're already putting into these scenarios, right? Because there's been lots of discussion about scenarios needing to be plausible, right, and consistent throughout the entire form. And from some perspectives, some ecological economics perspectives, basically they say, okay, an SP1, which we've had, is not sustainable in our minds. Right, so due to the increases in production, basically that it comes with. So I'm wondering what limits to growth are in your model, and should they be in the economic projections, even without climate impacts?
Okay, let's go with that. We'll go in reverse order this time, so I'll put Steve on the spot.
Cover it all.
Great set of comments and questions, so I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts and then hearing others. I'm not going to offer anything on the growth versus observations. A lot of people comment on that one, but I think that's a great question in terms of how we can think about some possible alternative ways of framing opportunities in the future and in terms of how economies might change. The with and without impacts question I think is really interesting as well. I can, from a diagnostic point of view, you can sort of think about, you kind of want to work through this progression of having kind of the no impacts case, but also you want to have this sort of endogenous response to the changing physical conditions as well to get some sense. And having the two then allows you to calculate the value of those changes as well as the costs associated with those changes. So just in terms of, I'm just thinking from as an analyst, right, you're trying to work through having those bits of information, and then you can evaluate on top of that sort of additional measures that could be pursued to address impacts. So I think there's a diagnostic reason for doing it. But I would argue, you made a comment at the end about being able to characterize sort of the cost of pathways. I would argue that the impacts storyline is going to affect both the costs of mitigation as well as the benefits. So we really, ultimately need to do it no matter what, right, to get better cost stories as well as better impact stories. I'm rephrasing a little bit what you said. It's kind of you're kind of asking a question about whether we're perpetuating the use of GDP to some degree, and maybe in some ways contributing to the problem as opposed to helping address it. I don't know if that's quite the way you phrased it, but I do think that's something that's happening. I mean, I'm not sure that we've started that, but it certainly is something that we can help address by providing people with more information in terms of other indicators and other ways of thinking about well-being, right? And sort of just differentiating GDP from well-being. So I think that is an important direction to go. So I'd certainly encourage us to go down that path. I wanted to talk about plausibility. I just think that is a really important issue, and part of it is us characterizing sort of the constraints in terms of how systems can evolve, right? So that has to do with some of the kinds of things that I was showing, the parametric choices that go into the model that would essentially bounds what are the possibilities in terms of what comes out. I think that's critical. I think the policy design plausibility question is really important too. We've been modeling essentially mostly idealized futures that are not anywhere close to the reality of how policies are unfolding. So that being able to sort of help better define sort of possible futures, I think, is really going to be important going forward. So plausibility is one dimension of feasibility. It's sort of saying things that are in or out, right? But then there's more nuance, right, dimension in terms of getting into likelihoods and possibilities that are potentially unfold. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I limit my response to the well-being thing. I mean, that's really close to my heart. Actually, the reason I'm not an integrated assessment climate modeler is because I actually focus on inclusiveness and distribution. So, I've been really working on these well-being indicators, and also in work that I've done trying to represent a whole set of indicators, keeping GDP out. And that's exactly what I then run into, is that you see all these different impacts across a wide range of indicators, right? Because well-being is not something you can capture in one alternative indicator that then goes up or down and makes everybody happy in terms of analysis. So you have to then grapple with this very diverse pattern, and that's also then very, again, region-specific. So people like to have one global number that tells them if it's good or bad. But then I'm like, no, there are many numbers that can go up and down. That's complicated. And then the next layer is there's also very much, say, sub-global differentiation between regions that have a very different pattern and a very different thing. And then it's so hard to get that across in, say, high-level communication and getting it out there. So that's really something I'm grappling with, and also looking more at communication side of things. Like, how do you do that? How do you manage that distribution? And I think we haven't decided that. There's a really large body of work on well-being, and you need more indicators, but not too many. So which indicators do you pick, and that kind of thing. So I think it's a key thing. We do a lot more, like on diets, on health, on distributions, inclusiveness, that kind of thing, than GDP. So really trying to get away from it. And I think to get it across and to get basically a policy in place that probably will lower GDP but increase well-being, you need to have a really good story on the well-being side. Because people are so accustomed to thinking, GDP growth declining or even GDP going down. I mean, people just freak out. You see the newspapers, right? It's like, GDP growth has slowed down. I'm like, so what? I mean, that's not relevant. But it's in the newspaper, and you don't get the other stuff in there. So, And then on the policy side, we're trying to really look at how you can change patterns of consumption and behavior. And there basically the struggle is to find, say, large-scale interventions that work. I mean, I raised a question in one of the sessions on this healthier diet that normally is modeled as people waking up overnight being vegetarian. And we have no idea how to do that. We simply don't know how to get such massive changes in behavior in a very short period. And I think that's a really big thing that we need to focus on. And the stuff that we do know, like high taxation and subsidies, are simply politically infeasible. They're not going to happen. So that's definitely a struggle, but it's definitely something we're trying to work on, but no clear answers yet.
So I fully agree with what has been said, but that said, I will take a slightly different perspective just a bit to challenge what has been said on that front. Just to start with an anecdote, I won't give the name indeed, but once I had the chance to present the outcome of a run of our simulations to a commissioner in Brussels. And so I entered into the details of the kind of things that we just said, And at the end of the discussion, he or she said, well, Mr. Fontaine, I'm very sorry, but given the figure that I see in your report on GDP, your model is not worth, the outcome of your model is not worth the electricity that your model consumes. So, meaning that, I don't give the name, but this is someone well known. So it is just showing you that still, even in Brussels, where you have, all the well-educated commissioner, etc., having a broad view of the society, etc., still GDP is there. And this is what we have to figure out, why is it that GDP is still there? So first of all, they think, and they're right, that GDP is income. GDP is just value added. So value added is income, and so this is the wage bill plus the return to capital. So this is it. So the split between the two is a distributional issue, and so this is something that we can figure out with our models, but still, this is income. And so for the policymakers, income is needed. When it comes to health, let's go to Paris these days and see what should be done for the hospital, for instance. When you go to the government and you discuss with them, they say, well, we need money. We need income. We need GDP in order to improve our hospitals, in order to improve the health of the society. And then you start discussing, well, but there is pollution, there are emissions, etc., and so this has to be taken into account. But they say, okay, but considering that we can fix this, what remains is income, and so with income, I will improve my health system. So this is really the type of discussion that you have. So this is a bit deceiving, but at least in the country that I know well, this is often like this. So now on the GDP flat, yes, we do have, and Rob also, I think, because the procedure at the end of the day is basically the same. We do have some countries where, there is hardly GDP growth, just because, you reach the technological frontier and everyone is well educated, and so you don't have the labor force and you just replace workers by robots, etc. So this is Japan, but there are other examples. And so you can reach a limit in terms of growth. But the problem is that at the world level, this is not this at all, because we have a lot of laggard countries, and so what these guys want to do is to converge very fast, and so the purpose for them is to grow very fast. And so when I combine the two views, we have kind of OECD perspective on growth and say, well, growth is something, but we have to consider leisure, etc. But when you go to developing economies, they have a totally different perspective, and this you know very well. And so we should think of the world economy and the decisions that are made in the different parts of the world and the policy that are, chosen in the different parts of the world, keeping this in mind. So in the different parts of the world, given the development level, the choice between, let's say, leisure and GDP might be totally different at the end of the day. And so this is like for emissions. When you are sitting around the table, most of the countries in the world don't follow our views. And so this is really the problem. We are a bit isolated. And the part of the world which is growing very fast is the part of the world that disagrees totally with our views. And so we have to take this into account. Just to challenge a bit the view.
Yeah, just as another anecdote on that, picking up on Marika, my first visit to China, I was on the Third Ring Road. At the time, it had 6 lanes in each direction. 3 were for cars and 3 were for bicycles. So the bicycle one was packed, the car one was packed. And my driver said, the problem in Beijing is there are too many bicycles. And now the 6 lanes are for cars, and traffic is much, much worse, of course, and all the pollution, congestion, health, and et cetera, et cetera. Rob?
Yeah, thanks. Many good points already raised, so I'm not going to add too much. Two remarks. First is, I think actually there has been a big shift in the sense that finance ministries, central banks are all now really hard trying to get climate change in their models. Our economics department, when they make their forecasts, They really want to learn about marginal abatement cost curves. They want to learn about impacts of climate change feedbacks because they want to have that in their models. They want very robust numbers, and otherwise they won't use it, which is a problem. But there is a lot of attention for it. I think that the climate change strategy at the OECD is written actually by the economics department, and unfortunately not by Amy, which is a pity. But anyway, so that's my first remark. It is getting mainstreamed, and we are in the process, and we get a lot of requests from finance ministries to compare how our CKE models work compared to their different types of economic forecast models, etc. Then a response to the question on the limits in the scenarios and the physical limits in these models. So we don't have physical limits in our GDP projections, but what we do is we project these GDP projections, and then we give them to the integrated assessment models, and we have all these 5 integrated assessment models run our scenarios and flag to us where are there major limits where you cannot really make a story that is compatible with the narratives in terms of land use, in terms of fossil fuel use, etc. And we made some small adjustments, but basically their response was, we can manage this. We can manage these GDP profiles in our integrated assessment models in a way that is consistent with the narratives. We do get negative growth in Japan, for example, but the idea of SSP1 especially is one of green growth. Is the idea, the narrative there is much more about changing to a world where I still buy a washing machine, but I buy one that is twice as expensive and lasts twice as long, so my GDP contribution of buying my washing machine stays exactly the same. The material consumption goes down rapidly. So there's a difference between GDP and material throughput in the economy, right? You know everything about that, no? We've done a lot of work on circular economy and plastics, etc. recently, and it's too easy to just say more GDP means more material consumption. Yes, historically that has been the case, but doesn't have to be the case. And when we're making these long-term scenarios, we have to make assumptions. What happens to air pollution? What happens to all kinds of policy domains? So we also need to think about things like the transition to a circular economy, and to what extent in SSP1 you get people recycling more. You get people doing all kinds of stuff that means you can combine value added, keeping up wages, etc., and combine that with lower material throughput in the economy.
We're getting close to time, so maybe 1 or 2 last questions before closing. Over here. Are we getting questions, by the way, from the web? No one's online. Well, I think the answer to that is no. Good. Oh, I don't know. Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. That's fine.
Okay. I wanted to pick up briefly on 2 points. The first one is by Rob just now. So the way we as integrated assessment modelers take up these GDP projections is that essentially the models are calibrated to match them. At least that's the case for REMA and MAGPIE, and to a certain extent also for other IAMs. And therefore, in order to really arrive at the point where we, with an IAM, would find that something is infeasible, would have to be a very extreme scenario. Usually you calibrate it to almost everything. And I'm saying this just so that we all know what is done with these GDP projections, and that we can't really claim that the IAMs are really, in that sense, a feasibility check on the GDP projections, because they are assumed. And the other one was towards a point from Lionel. Yeah, maybe you're right that part of the issue is that policymakers still have that thinking that improving GDP improves social services, improves well-being. But I think tightly coupled to that is the distributional dimension. With the current level of GDP per capita in high-income countries, you could fund much better social services even than we currently have in European countries. And so the question of distribution, I think, is very tightly coupled to how do we move away from GDP as only indicator?
Eric, you wanted to follow up?
Thank you. Last week was the European Society for Ecological Economics conference, and there was a session on a new IAM that's going to be coming out. It's Horizon 2020 funded, and it's going to be coming out in production next year, although they started putting technical materials up. It's called Within Limits IAM, or William with a single L. They've got their own built-in economic module, but more importantly, they explicitly take into account the recycling and kind of circular economy factors by material, because those vary considerably from one to the next. So just something to keep an eye on, that's all.
One more?
Yeah, thank you. Patrick von Niels, also from PIC. I also agree with Björn. So having GDP as a growth indicator, basically, and if you want that GDP grows, then you avoid, of course, the distribution question. So if you make the pie bigger, then you don't need to worry about how the shares of the pie are distributed. And I think that's an important point. But I actually wanted to make another point, and I think in these models, circular economy has popped up right now, but I think, and you mentioned it, that economic models miss labor quite often, but there's another big share of labor that is often missed, and that is not human labor, but the labor by species, ecosystems, etc., that are quite crucial in defining the space, and I think these are not mentioned so far, and just to give the challenge back to you as the speakers. Yeah.
Great. All right. So, speakers, final words. We'll go back in the original order. Rob?
How can you do this to me? All right. Ecosystem services. It's a tough one. I've been trying. We're doing every 10 years or so at OECD, we're doing something called an environmental outlook, where we look at the state of the environment across climate change, air pollution, biodiversity, ecosystems, water, and a range more, and we'll add circular economy and plastics in the next round. The one on biodiversity is always the one that gets outsourced to image model or whatever model that has that is out there, because there are basically hardly any economic models that do biodiversity and ecosystems in a decent way. This is something that is very hard to find. I haven't seen any real convincing evidence. Not saying that there's nobody out there that does this very good. Oh, sorry, Rob Alkemaat is there. He's doing interesting work on biodiversity and ecosystems. But there's not a lot out there that I can use in my large scale, beyond outsourcing it to others. So that makes it hard. But there is one step I think that we can and should take. For example, in the SSPs, look at commodity rents and look at the exports of raw materials and how dependent countries are in that. And that doesn't go exactly in the direction that you want to go, which is more about the nature side of things. But in terms of measuring income growth, etc., that is important. The other thing that I wanted to say is, the problem with, so Björn, you're saying, I'm giving you GDP, then your integrated assessment model says, I need to work with this GDP, and therefore I'll just tweak my integrated assessment model until I find a land use allocation that fits with that GDP. So you're basically, reflecting it back to me, like where's the responsibility for doing the reality check on whether we have those resources? Perfectly fine, but can we together find a third person that we can get this to? Because my GDP model certainly will never be able to model the interactions between the economic system and the biophysical system in as much detail as you are. So even if you can't do it, which integrated model do we need to look at to know whether we need to take these restrictions seriously or not?
So, as you may have seen, my usual position is Paris School of Economics. And when I say this, the ring bells in terms of, distributional issues, etc. We have one colleague which is, hammering on us, basically weekly to insist on the importance, rightly, of this dimension of the economic growth inequality. The problem that we have in the models that we use is that at some point we are reaching a limit in terms of complexity. So in terms of computing, you can do increasingly complex things because the computing possibilities are much higher than they were. But still, when you had, and this is something that you may contradict, but when you add layers of complexity in the model, it becomes difficult to see exactly where the model goes, why, etc. So you need to face the critique of a black box. So I think that studies on inequalities, etc. are very important. But when it comes to a global model, it's really difficult. If we were to use a national model, a general equivalent model, but at the national level or even at the European level, something like this, then it would be kind of easy to plug in considerations in terms of income distribution, different, groups, etc. But if you think of a global model, and this is typically what we have in mind when it comes to, emissions and the rest, climate, you have to think of distribution in India, distribution in China, distribution in Sub-Saharan Africa, distribution in the US, in Europe, etc. And this is really something difficult. So I think that this is an avenue for research, but we are not there yet. One element that we didn't discuss much is the PPPs thing. So this was announced. And what we do basically in the first step of the projections, when we use the macro model in our project, we have both. We have the PPP side of the story, and we have the constant dollar part of the story. Why so? Because the PPP is really something that you need in order to take on board the kind of issues that we are thinking of. So what is the actual level of the standard of living given relative prices in the different countries, and this is something which is very important. But still, when we have been doing this, we have been facing exactly the problem that you mentioned yesterday, meaning the change in the basis year for PPP, etc. That has been creating a mess. I can tell you, we have been spending 1 month understanding exactly what's happened. So this is something that you need, and then you need the constant dollar because this is what we have in the models, and so you have to project both, meaning that this is really an issue how to reconcile the two. And when it comes to emissions, we indeed have an issue which is very technical and that has not been discussed this morning. When we have CES type of functions, we have to make sure that the values and the quantities match. And for some reasons that you may want to elaborate on, they don't. And so we have to find tricks in order to reconcile the two, and these are tricks actually. So we have to keep this in mind. So this is it for me, and I've grabbed good ideas for the future of the kind of work I'm doing on the various issues. Thanks.
Yeah, just two general points. On inequality, what Lionel said, we work with global models, and we've actually been trying to, we had a period where we tried to get more household data. And just for your information, what we have in the models is that every country has one single representative household. So for the Netherlands, say we have one guy doing all the consumption. That has partly to do with it's a very big one. No, but the point there is we don't have the data, right? So basically we work from national accounts, so you know the total consumption in the country, you need household survey data to basically get this differentiation between households. So we worked on that for quite a while, basically for developing countries, because for institutional reasons there are better data there, because the World Bank and other organizations, if pre-fund actually those more detailed data collections. For Europe we had a hard time finding the data. Then what we found though is that the data, when we put them in, are actually very limited in terms of differentiation of consumption patterns. And also sometimes in terms of income sources. What it actually means, if you put it in a model that we have, is that if you have this basically very uniform households in your system, they're not generating any interesting feedback loops, right? So there's a whole bunch of detail in there, but in the end, it doesn't do anything to your results. So we spend all this time on data on getting this stuff sorted. We can never have thousands of households in every region in the model because it will literally blow up. So actually, our decision has been a few years back that we just basically cut the line of research. And we go for micro analysis. So we say, okay, the global models are very good at having interactions between countries, getting the sectoral shifts, getting all that stuff sorted out. If you are interested in inequality, which is very key, you need an additional micro simulation or micro level assessment that's as consistent as possible with the macro level results. And basically, that's just based on the data we have. That's the avenue I think you should go. So anybody interested in that, I would really recommend go that route. Don't try to squeeze that thing into a global CG. It's not working. It's different if you have a national one, you can do more detail, but in a global one, it's not working. Everybody basically stopped that line of work. And the other thing I wanted to say, but on the environmental services, we're all kind of like into that. I mean, there's several projects that are starting on it. People want to have a better idea of that. And I'm not involved in those, but I did have a bit of discussion with my colleagues. I'm like, there is an inherent risk there, right? People have still this obsession with GDP, with money, with dollars. By the time you start measuring those services in terms of monetary values, first of all, it's very hard. There are no good markets out there. You have no good valuation. So you can get a huge debate on what valuation method you use. That's one thing on the data side. But of course, it also generates the option once you put it in these type of models that you start compensating, right? So like you basically say, okay, I can fully degrade the environment, destroy all environmental services, as long as I make enough money, right? Because then you can just balance it out. So I think it's needed. We need to get a better handle on it, but I think we also have to be very careful in our analysis and how it's going to be used in the end to not justify basically full degradation of environmental areas that we just want to protect for what they are, not for the monetary value, but just for the inherent value that they have. So that's basically warning out there. I think it's needed. We need to address it. We need to kind of bring it into the discussion, but be wary of the thing that is all going to be expressed in dollars. And then we have the elevator thing. Then if it goes up, it's fine. If it goes down, it's bad. But you might destroy a lot that you're never going to get back if you get your dollar values up. So. And that's coming from an economist. So.
Last word. Well, you get the last word. So I just thought I would offer sort of 4 suggestions for improving beyond GDP, sort of going back to the overarching objective of the session. And I don't know if this is helpful to folks, but it's sort of, to me, it's kind of boiling down much of the conversation to 4 things for me. One is the importance of modeling underlying structure, right? We really need to be thinking about what's actually happening within the economy. How does it look? How might it potentially evolve? 2 is considering uncertainty and constraints in specification, right? So not maybe something as formal as what we did, but trying to better understand how just the specification and whether there are limits on those specifications might potentially impact what we're seeing and potentially thinking about in the future. 3 is institutions, governance, policy design. I lumped all that together. I think that's critical, right? It represents constraints. It represents the incentive structure for moving forward. It's going to shape all the possibilities. And 4 is this issue of welfare, well-being, and I would say incentives for pursuing those particular metrics, right? So we think about a lot of our incentives aren't set up with respect to those particular metrics, partly because we don't necessarily, we're not quite sure how to specify those metrics, and there's alternative ones. But if we think about sort of designing incentives that are focused on those outcomes versus the ones that we're less satisfied with, right, then we can explore some other ways that we can evolve in a way that's focused on those, on welfare and well-being. So there you go. Thanks.
Let's give a round of applause to our panelists. Very stimulating discussion, which we can continue at, I believe, the coffee break. Yeah? Thank you very much.